Imagine, just for a moment, that you've spent your entire life desperately trying to put out this raging fire.
Oh, yeah, just completely exhausted.
Right. You're burned, you're exhausted, you have pushed yourself to the absolute breaking point trying to save all these people trapped inside.
Hmm.
And then, in this sudden moment of total clarity, you realize that the fire, the water you're throwing on it, and the very people you're trying to save are all made of completely empty
There's
space.
zero inherent substance.
Exactly. Like they lack any inherent substance whatsoever. So, I mean, why would you pick up the bucket again?
Right, why bother?
Yeah. Why keep fighting a fire that isn't inherently real to save people who don't, inherently exist?
Well, that's the ultimate friction point of Mahayana praxis, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's exactly where we're starting today, where we're just bypassing the shallow end completely for this deep dive.
No training wheels today.
None at all. Because if you're listening to this, you already know the temperature of the water. We are speaking directly to you, our fellow seasoned travelers in Madhyamaka philosophy.
You know the drill.
Exactly. You already know the tetralemma inside and out. You know that emptiness is dependently co-arisen.
Right. It's a tool.
Right? You know it's a conventional tool, like a solvent, and absolutely not the ultimate reality. It is not tathata.
No, absolutely not. So, okay, let's unpack this. We are diving straight into Nagarjuna's hymn of the World Transcendent, the Lokatitastava.
Such a brilliant text.
It really is. It's basically a surgical operation on your own consciousness. And our mission today isn't just to, read it.
No, we want to see the mechanics.
Yeah, we want to examine how Nagarjuna builds this radical, all-consuming framework in literally just 28 verses.
It's incredibly dense.
So dense, and how that framework just completely dismantles the cognitive machinery we use to perceive reality.
We're talking about applying his solvent to the two truths themselves, to the very ground of experience, and even the three kayas.
Which is wild. But that visual of the fire you were agreeing with earlier, that's the perfect entry point. Because he doesn't start this text with some dry, logical proof about epistemology.
No, he doesn't start with the tetralemma. He starts with the messy, lived manifestation of emptiness.
Compassion.
Exactly. Compassion. He opens by praising the Buddha, the one who is entirely beyond the world, who perfectly knows the void,
Right.
but who exhibits this untiring compassion solely for the benefit of a world that ultimately lacks inherent existence.
Let's push on that right away, because the text states so plainly that apart from the mere skandhas, no living being exists.
Right. Just the aggregates.
But then the sage just completely exhausts himself for the sake of these non-existent beings. And when you sit with that, like on the cushion, it creates this massive cognitive dissonance.
Oh, massive. It hurts your brain.
It does. If I'm a programmer who builds this immensely complex simulation, right?
Yeah.
And I know with absolute certainty that the digital entities running around are just lines of code, just variables interacting without any ghost in the machine.
Right. No soul.
Yeah, no soul. Why on earth would I dedicate my life to preventing their software errors? Doesn't knowing they're empty breed this kind of aloof detachment?
Well, it does if you misunderstand emptiness as nihilism, which frankly is the most common trap for advanced practitioners.
The void.
Yeah, the trap of the void.
Yeah.
If the programmer says, well, it's all just empty code, none of it matters, they've fallen into the extreme of non-existence.
They lose their compassion.
Exactly. But conversely, if they reify the code, if they forget it's a simulation and start believing the entities are inherently real, suffering beings.
Then they fall into the extreme of existence.
Right. They get overwhelmed, they burn out, they suffer right alongside the program. Nagarjuna is pointing out that the Buddha operates exactly in that impossible middle space.
So, I mean, how does that middle space actually function? Because it's super easy to say union of the two truths, but living it is a whole different ballgame.
It's completely different.
If I'm meditating on the absolute lack of inherent self in myself and others, where does the fuel for action even come from?
The fuel comes from the precise realization that suffering is dependently originated.
Okay, unpack that.
Well, you don't need an inherently existent being for there to be a conventional experience of suffering.
Ah, right.
The programmer doesn't need the digital entity to have a soul to recognize that a glitch in the code causes the system to crash,
That makes sense.
The exhaustion for the sake of beings is like the ultimate prototype for acting without acting. You use conventional methods to alleviate conventional suffering.
But without buying into the absolute reality of it.
Precisely. You do it without any absolute reification of the beings who are suffering, or even the self who is supposedly saving them.
It's a completely non-dualistic engagement. Like, you're deeply involved, but entirely unbound. It almost sounds like playing an elaborate game.
I wouldn't call it a game, though.
No.
No, because a game kind of implies triviality. It's more like, it's like lucid dreaming.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Right. When you're in a lucid dream, you know the dream monster isn't inherently real.
Yeah, you know you're asleep.
But if you see another dream character running in terror from that monster, your compassion for their terror is genuine.
Because they're really experiencing the fear.
Exactly. Their experience of suffering is happening conventionally, even if the basis of it is an illusion. So you step in to help them wake up,
You exhaust yourself to wake them up.
fully knowing that the monster, and the act of waking up are all just part of the dream.
Okay, wow, that makes perfect sense. The tension between the absolute and the conventional isn't some contradiction we have to solve.
Not at all.
It's the actual engine of the bodhisattva path. But, okay, to really grasp why the programmer sees only code, or why the lucid dreamer sees only a dream, we have to look at how he deconstructs the experiential machinery itself.
Right, the aggregates.
Yeah.
The skandhas.
Yeah, if there are no beings, just mere skandhas, what exactly are these skandhas to Nagarjuna?
This is where he starts taking our perception apart piece by piece. He compares the skandhas, form, feeling, perception, mental formations, consciousness, to an illusion.
A mirage.
A mirage, a city of Gandharvas, and a dream.
And as advanced practitioners, we know we can't just brush past those as poetic metaphor.
No, they aren't just pretty words. There's a very precise epistemological reason he uses those specific metaphors.
Because each of those things appears so vividly to the senses, right?
Yes.
But they totally lack the substance they seem to possess. Let's dig into the mechanics of that. He says the skandhas occur due to a cause, and they don't exist without it.
They're like reflections.
Yeah, the reflection metaphor. That feels like the most robust tool here.
It really is, because think about what a reflection requires. It's this complex matrix of dependent co-arising.
Need a mirror?
You need a mirror, you need light, you need an object casting the reflection, and you need a perceiving consciousness to even see it.
And if you take away even one of those,
boom, the reflection is gone. It ceases to exist entirely.
it has zero independent ontological status.
Zero. Yet, conventionally, it appears perfectly fine. Like you can shave your face looking in a mirror. It functions.
It works. But hold on. This is where my mind, and I think the minds of a lot of practitioners, starts to violently push back on the cushion.
Oh, absolutely. The ego fights it.
It really does. If the skandhas are just a reflection, a co-arisen phenomenon, my immediate instinct is to look for the mirror.
Yes.
Or to look for the original object casting the reflection. Like if my experience of form and feeling is just a reflection, what is the real thing casting it?
And that instinct is exactly what Nagarjuna is targeting.
He knows we're going to do that.
He totally knows. That is the mind desperately trying to smuggle inherent existence back into the equation through the back door.
We just want a ground to stand on.
We do. We hear reflection, and we think, okay, sure, the conventional world is a reflection, but it must be a reflection of some absolute base reality.
Yes, because otherwise it feels like I'm just falling through empty space.
Which is terrifying.
It is. Take physical form, for instance. He attacks this by saying the four great elements, earth, water, fire, wind, are imperceptible to the eye. Therefore, he rejects the belief in form altogether.
Right.
But, I mean, if I stub my toe on a rock, my bruised toe is going to strongly argue that the rock has some kind of inherent perceptible form.
Your toe is definitely going to argue that.
So are you saying the rock didn't exist until I felt the pain?
Well, let's separate conventional causality from absolute co-arising here.
Okay.
Conventionally, yes, the collection of atoms we label rock preceded the event of your toe colliding with it.
Sure.
But Nagarjuna is drilling down into the actual substance of that rock. We normally think, okay, a rock is made of minerals.
Minerals are made of molecules.
Molecules are made of atoms. Atoms are made of quantum fields.
That's correct.
We just assume that at the very bottom of the rabbit hole, there's some solid self-existent stuff.
Like tiny little billiard balls.
Exactly. But as even modern physics has discovered, the deeper you go, the more the stuff just vanishes into mere relationships.
Probabilities.
Right. The fundamental elements aren't objects you can grasp. They're just capacities.
So if the foundational building blocks lack inherent independent form, the macro object, the rock, cannot possess inherent form either.
It mathematically can't.
It's just an imputation. My mind synthesizes the tactile resistance, the visual data, and the conceptual label into a single, seemingly solid entity called rock.
Exactly. Now apply that back to your stub toe.
Ouch.
Nagarjuna points out that feeling is without self, because it doesn't exist without an object to be felt.
Right.
And the object of feeling doesn't exist by its own being either. They co-impute one another.
Okay, wait, walk me through the mechanics of that co-imputation, because, again, the rock feels very independent when it's causing me agony.
The sensation of pain, the feeling skandha, cannot arise independently. It requires the context of the rock, your nervous system, and your consciousness, right?
Yeah, if I'm anesthetized, there's no pain.
Exactly. So the feeling has no independent self. But the rock is pain causer, the object of your specific feeling in that exact moment, also doesn't exist independently of your toe and your consciousness.
Wait, really?
Think about it. A rock sitting alone in a field is not an object of pain.
Oh, okay, I see.
It only becomes an object of pain in mutual dependence with your feeling of pain. They arise together in that exact moment.
It's a closed loop, like trying to find the beginning of a knot tied in a circle.
That's a great way to put it.
You pull on the subject string, and the object string tightens. You pull on the object, and the subject tightens.
And there is no original object casting the reflection.
It's just reflections reflecting
Oh, yes.
reflections.
Precisely. And this is exactly where advanced meditation practice often hits a wall of pure terror.
The psychological vertigo.
Yes. When you sit and deconstruct your experience, when you realize that the watcher of the breath is just as empty and co-arisen as the breath itself, you get that vertigo.
Because the ego realizes there is no solid ground.
There is no original object. The experiential machinery is entirely fluid.
That vertigo is intense. It's the feeling that if you let go of the concepts, you might just cease to exist entirely.
Which you won't, conventionally, but the ego thinks it will.
Right. Which is a perfect segue, actually, because this fluidity, this total lack of solid ground, it doesn't just apply to physical objects or feelings.
No, it goes much deeper.
It infects the very language we use to try and stabilize our reality. Like the moment we try to even talk about this vertigo, we fall into a trap.
The linguistic trap.
Yeah, and Nagarjuna is just merciless about dismantling the linguistic bridge between subject and object.
This is perhaps one of the most critical pivots in the text. As practitioners, our primary tool for navigating the Dharma is conceptual thought and language, right?
We read texts, we listen to deep dives like this, we formulate intentions.
Exactly. So Nagarjuna has to demonstrate that our linguistic maps are not the territory.
And furthermore, that the territory itself actively defies mapping.
Yes. The analogy he uses here is just stunning. He points out that if a concept and its object were completely identical, the word fire would literally burn your mouth when you spoke it.
It's such a brilliant use of the tetralemma against linguistics.
Let's unpack the logic for a second. If the designation fire and the designated phenomenon combustion were one and the same, inherently identical,
Then just uttering the sound would produce heat and flames on your tongue. The word would literally be the thing.
and clearly that is false. I can say fire all day and I won't get burned.
Right, but the second half is what really trips up the intellect. If the concept and the object are not identical, my mind immediately swings to the opposite extreme.
Which is that they must be completely different.
Exactly. My mind says there must be a hard, absolute boundary between the sound I make and the physical fire.
But if there were an absolute inherent difference, if they were completely disconnected entities, then the word would have no ability to point to the object at all.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
I could say fire, and you might think of a puddle of water, or a cloud, or, I don't know, a concept of justice.
There would be zero shared comprehension.
The word only functions because it is dependently co-arisen with the object through social convention, memory, and shared human experience.
They are inextricably linked, yet empty of any inherent connection. So, okay, if words are just conventional maps that have no absolute link to the territory, how do we even function?
That's the million-dollar question.
Like, how is Nagarjuna himself using language to teach us that language is empty? It feels like pulling the rug out from under your own feet while you're still standing on it.
It is pulling the rug out.
Okay.
But remember our earlier discussion about the simulation programmer?
Right.
Nagarjuna is using language conventionally without reifying it, absolutely. He is using empty words to dissolve your grasping at other empty words.
It's like using a wooden wedge to knock another wooden wedge out of a piece of furniture.
And then what do? You discard both.
You discard both. Wow. And he applies this exact same relational interdependence to everything, doesn't he?
Everything.
He looks at the agent and the action. He looks at merit and demerit. He looks at the knower and the known.
Basically saying there is no object of knowledge unless it is being known, but the knowing consciousness doesn't exist without its object.
This just strikes right at the heart of our spiritual materialism.
Oh, it destroys it.
We spend so much time on the path trying to become a knower of truth. We want to accumulate merit, purify demerit, establish ourselves as this advanced agent of action.
And Nagarjuna is warning us. He's saying conventionally, yes, merit and demerit originate dependently.
If you act with greed, suffering follows.
If you act with generosity, ease follows.
Yeah.
But do not reify them.
Don't turn your spiritual progress into an inherently existent bank account.
Exactly, because the agent acting, the action of accumulating, and the merit accumulated are all mutually dependent.
And therefore ultimately unoriginated.
Right. If you strip away every object of knowledge, every sight, sound, thought, realization, memory, what is left of the inherently existent knowing consciousness?
It just vanishes.
It completely vanishes. A knower is only a knower in relation to a known. They are mutually established. If the mark and the marked are neither different nor identical, neither exists inherently.
Which leads to this incredible statement in the text. With your eye of knowledge, you view this world as calm, that is devoid of marked object and marked subject, and free from the utterances of words.
Free from prapanyaka,
Prapanyaka.
conceptual proliferation.
It's that endless recursive chattering of the dualistic mind, just trying to slice reality into manageable, inherently existent pieces.
The compulsion to name, categorize, judge, separate.
Exactly.
But I really want to dwell on this for a second, because the risk here is that a world free from prapanyaka sounds, well, like a lobotomy.
It does sound a bit bleak if you misinterpret it.
It sounds like you just sit staring at a wall in a blank, featureless void, drooling because you've successfully unnamed everything.
Right.
And I know practitioners who have actually chased that state, trying to forcefully suppress all thought, mistaking a blank mind for ultimate reality. That is a very common and very dangerous dead end in meditation.
Yeah.
Suppressing thought is just another action of an agent trying to manipulate an object. It's deeply dualistic. A world free from prapanyaka is not a blank void.
Because that would be the extreme of non-existence?
Exactly. Remember the middle way. We are not negating the conventional appearance of phenomena. We are negating their inherent existence.
So what does it actually feel like to perceive the world this way?
To view the world free from words is to perceive everything as a primordially equal, calm, and beyond conditioned dualistic tension.
Okay, so you still see the free?
You still see the tree, you still feel the warmth of the fire, you still engage in complex actions like programming that simulation or helping a struggling friend.
But the mind isn't frantically building that secondary, rigid, conceptual universe on top of the raw data.
Exactly. You are constantly asserting, I am seeing a tree, the tree is real, I like the tree.
It's experiencing the territory without obsessively referencing the map. The phenomenal world doesn't vanish into a gray fog. If anything, it probably becomes more vivid because that tension of holding it all together with concepts vanishes.
Exactly. The world is seen as calm, not because it is empty of activity, but because the violent internal act of conceptually slicing it up has ceased.
The grasping has ceased.
The grasping is gone.
Okay, so we've dissolved the subject and the object. We've completely dismantled the linguistic and conceptual bridge between them.
We've done a lot of dismantling.
We really have.
Yeah.
But there is another dimension that we implicitly rely on to make sense of reality, and that is time.
Time.
Even if I accept that the subject and object are empty, co-arisen reflections, my mind tries to escape the trap by hiding in time.
It's the ultimate hiding spot for the ego.
It is. I think, sure, the feeling of pain is empty now, but a real cause in the past created it, and it will have real consequences in the future. Does Nagarjuna let us get away with hiding in time?
Absolutely not. In fact, his attack on time and causality is perhaps the most unforgiving logic in the entire hymn.
He takes no prisoners here.
None. He takes the three marks of conditioned existence, origination, duration, and destruction, and subjects them to the exact same rigorous deconstruction.
Let's start with origination. He says, an existent thing does not arise, nor does a non-existent thing, nor something that is both existent and non-existent. So how can it be born at all?
We really have to keep our definitions very sharp here. When Nagarjuna says an existent thing, he means something that possesses inherent, absolute, independent existence.
Okay.
If a thing already inherently exists, its very nature is to be. It doesn't need to arise. It's already there.
The concept of arising becomes completely redundant.
Exactly.
And on the flip side, if a thing is inherently non-existent, it cannot arise because it has no basis for existence.
Right. You can't squeeze existence out of pure absolute nothingness.
So in an absolute sense, nothing is ever actually born.
Yeah.
The arising of phenomena is purely a conventional, dependently co-arisen appearance. But if nothing is inherently born, then nothing can be inherently destroyed. And this brings us to a part of the text that I find so delightfully sharp. It's almost humorous, but totally devastating.
Oh, I know what you're going to say.
He says, "It is not reasonable that an existent, which must be linked to duration, should be destroyed. And how can something non-existent, like the horns of a horse, be extinguished?"
The horns of a horse. It's a classic Indian philosophical trope.
I just love, you can't kill a horse's horns because a horse doesn't have horns. You can't destroy something that never existed in the first place.
Right.
But let me play the materialist devil's advocate here for a second.
Go for it.
Why is it not reasonable that an existent thing should be destroyed? Things break all the time. A tree falls in the forest and rots. My coffee mug shattered on the floor this morning.
Tragic.
It was.
Yeah.
But that feels like very real destruction.
It feels real conventionally, yes. But again, look at the absolute substance. If your coffee mug possessed absolute independent existence, its fundamental nature would be existent. To destroy it would mean changing its fundamental nature from existent to non-existent.
Right.
But if its core nature can be altered by external forces like gravity and a hard floor, then it was never absolute or independent to begin with. It was merely a temporary, dependently originated arrangement of elements.
So if it can be destroyed, it was never truly real in the absolute sense.
Yes.
And if it is truly real, it can never be destroyed. The logic is just a suffocating trap for the materialist mind.
He elaborates on this beautifully. He asks, is destruction different from the entity itself?
Okay.
If destruction is a separate thing, then the entity remains perfectly intact and permanent while destruction happens somewhere else over in the corner.
That makes no sense.
Right. But if destruction is identical to the entity, if the entity is its own destruction, then it could never have existed as a stable entity in the first place. It would be in a constant state of non-existence.
So origination and destruction are not absolute realities, but what about the bridge between them? What about causality?
The sticky part.
Yeah. If I plant a seed, a sprout grows. That is undeniable conventional reality. How does Nagarjuna attack the causal link itself?
He focuses on the temporal gap, the exact junction point of causality. He asks, does the effect arise from a cause that has been destroyed or from one that has not yet been destroyed?
Okay, let's break that down. If the seed, the cause, is completely destroyed before the sprout arises, the connection is severed.
The cause is entirely gone. It is non-existent.
So how can a non-existent thing produce an effect? Where does the sprout draw its reality from if the cause is already dead?
Exactly. It's impossible. But let's look at the alternative. Suppose the cause is not destroyed. The seed is still fully present, intact, and unchanging.
Okay.
If the cause hasn't ceased, how can the effect begin? For the seed to remain a seed, it cannot yet be a sprout.
Right, they can't both be there.
If both exist at once, you have two separate entities, not a causal sequence. They would have to exist simultaneously, which completely defies the linear sequence of causality.
I remember meditating on this specific point during a retreat, trying to find the exact microsecond where the in-breath becomes the out-breath.
It's maddening, isn't it?
It is. You try to zoom in on that junction point. At what exact moment does the seed hand the baton to the sprout? And the closer you look, you realize you can infinitely divide that moment in time.
Zeno's paradox, basically.
Exactly. You will never, ever find a solid bridge where cause touches effect.
Because there is no inherently existent baton, and there are no inherently existent runners.
It's just empty.
The junction point is a mental imputation. We see state A, we see state B, and our conceptual mind draws a solid line between them and labels it causality.
We demand a narrative.
We do. But upon analysis, the line is a phantom. It is, as Nagarjuna says, like an illusion.
This leads to an incredibly profound conclusion about our entire reality. After all this intense shredding logic, he says, therefore, you have fully understood that this world has arisen due to imagination. It is unreal, and not having originated it cannot be destroyed.
And the term translated here as imagination is often vikalpa in Sanskrit.
Vikalpa.
Yes, it means conceptual construction. The active dividing, sorting, and imputing done by the dualistic mind.
I really want to emphasize the liberation hidden in this realization. Because if you just hear the world is unreal and arises due to imagination, it sounds horribly bleak.
It sounds like solipsism or nihilism.
Yeah, you might think, well, nothing matters, it's all fake. But if we connect this to the reflection metaphor, the linguistic trap, the gap in causality, this is actually the ultimate empowerment for a practitioner.
How so? Walk us through your understanding of that empowerment.
Well, if the world were inherently real, solid, and bound by absolute cause and effect, I would be a prisoner in it.
Right.
I would be crushed by its absolute laws. My suffering would be an inescapable, concrete reality.
You'd be stuck.
But if the rigidity of the world is co-imputed by my own vikalpa, my own conceptual construction, then the world is fluid.
It's malleable.
Yes. By changing my mind's relationship to phenomena, by ceasing to reify them, the world itself is transformed. I don't have to physically destroy the universe to be free of it. I simply have to stop building it in my mind.
That is the exact pivot from bondage to liberation. You see the world as unoriginated and therefore indestructible. You can't be destroyed by a dream once you know you are dreaming.
You cannot be killed by the horns of a horse.
Exactly.
But if origination and destruction are illusions born of conceptual construction, then we have to confront the biggest sacred cow in Buddhism.
Oh boy, here we go.
The ultimate cycle of origination and destruction is samsara itself. We can't just leave samsara sitting there as this big, scary, absolute reality while claiming everything inside it is empty.
No, we cannot. And this brings us to the climax of the hymn. Having systematically deconstructed experience, language, and time, Nagarjuna turns his lens on the macrostructure of the Buddhist path itself.
He goes right for the throat.
He does. He states bluntly that samsara is like a dream. There is no permanent wandering in it, nor impermanent wandering.
And the suffering within that dream isn't self-created. It isn't created by another. It isn't created by both. And it isn't without a cause. It arises dependently.
Which brings us to the absolute centerpiece of the text, the lion's roar.
What arises dependently is exactly what you regard as shunyata. Oh, your incomparable lion's roar is that no independent thing exists.
The equation of dependent arising with shunyata, or emptiness, for you, the advanced practitioner listening to this is the touchstone you return to 1,000 times a day.
Emptiness is not a place you go.
No, it is not a void hiding behind the illusion of the world.
Let's really drill into this because the subtle dualism is just so hard to shake. We often harbor this lingering, almost unconscious belief that the phenomenal world is the fake illusion.
Right.
And if we meditate hard enough and wipe away all the sights and sounds and thoughts, we will uncover a glowing, blank, absolute reality called emptiness.
We treat emptiness like it's the canvas, and phenomena are the paint.
Exactly. And that is exactly the subtle grasping that Nagarjuna is trying to destroy.
The lion's roar shatters that dualism completely.
Yeah.
The very fact that a thing is dependent on causes and conditions is its emptiness.
You don't look beyond the dependently arisen tree to find the emptiness of the tree.
The tree's dependence is its emptiness. The reflection in the mirror is the emptiness of the reflection. Form is emptiness. Emptiness is form.
Which makes the very next verse the most crucial warning in the entire text. This is the danger zone for everyone listening to this right now.
The ultimate warning.
He says, the ambrosial teaching of shunyata aims at abolishing all inherent conceptions. But if someone believes in shunyata meaning, if they grasp at emptiness as the ultimate reality, you have declared that he is lost.
It is the ultimate diagnostic check. Emptiness is a medicine. It is a solvent designed to dissolve all conceptual grasping, all reification of self and other.
It breaks down the tumors of inherent existence.
Right.
But if you drink the solvent, you die.
Exactly. If you use emptiness to dissolve all your concepts about the world, and then your mind looks at that puddle of dissolved concepts and says, aha, this puddle is the ultimate reality.
I have found the absolute truth, and it is emptiness.
You have turned the cure into a deadly poison. You have reified emptiness itself. You have made emptiness into a new, incredibly subtle, incredibly dangerous thing.
It's like using a roaring fire to burn away all the garbage in your house and then sitting down to worship the ashes.
Or worse, burning your house down and then trying to live inside the fire.
Yeah, that's even worse. And this is why we noted at the very beginning of this deep dive that emptiness is not tathata.
It is not suchness or ultimate reality in a positive affirmative sense. Emptiness itself is dependently co-arisen.
It is empty of inherent existence. It is a tool. And once the task of dissolving inherent conceptions is complete, the tool must be put down.
So how does a practitioner actually avoid this subtle grasping? Because if the mind's nature is to grasp, how do we exist without grasping at either the conventional world or the emptiness of the world?
Nagarjuna gives us the definition of the true middle way here. You have put forward nothing and denied nothing. Now, as then, you are fully aware of suchness.
Putting forward nothing and denying nothing.
It requires a profound agility of mind. To put forward nothing means you don't assert any absolute inherent truth about the universe.
You don't erect a philosophical flagpole and say, this is the ultimate reality. You don't even assert that all things are empty as an absolute inherent law.
But crucially, to deny nothing means you don't fall into the trap of nihilism. You don't reject the conventional functioning of the world.
Right. You don't deny cause and effect. You don't deny the reality of suffering for sentient beings.
You don't deny the validity of a red light at an intersection. You still stop your car.
Please stop your car. You use the models, you use the maps, you use the methods, you even use the concept of the three kayas, or the stages of the bodhisattva path, conventionally but entirely non-dualistically.
You are deeply aware of their true nature and dynamic. You know they are reflections, but you know how reflections function.
Because you are not expending massive amounts of psychological energy trying to force the universe into absolute categories of real or unreal, the grasping relaxes.
And in that relaxation, you become fully aware of suchness, tathata.
Reality as it is, unmediated by vikalpa. You perceive everything as primordially equal, pure, and complete.
And yet, even with this profound realization of suchness, the work isn't over. There is still the conventional world, the dream, full of beings who are suffering because they believe the dream is real.
Nagarjuna warns that there is no liberation unless one resorts to the signless transcending all dualistic conceptual proliferation.
But then we arrive at the final verse, which brings us perfectly full circle to the paradox we started with.
Verse 28.
He writes, "By the merit which I have attained by praising you, a fit vessel of praise, may the entire world become free from the bondage of signs."
It's dedication without dedication. Think about the layers of realization operating in this single sentence. The sage knows there are no living beings apart from the mere skandhas.
The sage has put forward nothing and denied nothing.
The sage knows that merit itself is dependently co-arisen, inherently empty, and ultimately unoriginated.
The sage knows that the entire world arises due to imagination.
And knowing all of that with absolute clarity, the sage still takes the time to dedicate that empty merit for the freedom of that empty world.
Because that is the only logical conclusion of the middle way. If you have truly freed yourself from the bondage of signs, from the grasping at inherent existence, what else is there to do but compassionately engage with the mirage?
You don't flee the simulation. You optimize it for the liberation of the code, knowing full well the code is empty.
The union of wisdom and compassion is perfected. You help others wake up.
Exactly.
Okay, let's take a breath and synthesize the massive journey we just took through the Lokatitastava.
It's been a ride.
We started with that incredible friction point. The paradox of the Buddha's untiring compassion for non-existent beings.
We use that lens to deconstruct the experiential machinery, seeing the skandhas as reflections.
And realizing that feeling and the object of feeling are an inescapable loop of co-imputation where neither exists independently.
From there, we tackled the linguistic trap. We saw that concepts and their objects are neither identical nor completely different.
The word fire doesn't burn the mouth, but it still communicates meaning through dependent co-arising.
We applied that logic to agents, actions, and the knower and the known, dissolving them into mutual dependence and arriving at a calm world free from conceptual proliferation.
Then we dismantled time and causality, realizing that destruction is illogical when applied to absolute existence or non-existence. You can't kill a horse's horns.
We saw that the junction between cause and effect is impossible to pinpoint, and that the world itself arises due to our own conceptual imagination.
Which brought us to the ultimate climax. Sora itself is a dream. The lion's roar declares that this very dependent arising is emptiness.
We received the critical warning not to grasp at emptiness as a new absolute reality, not to drink the solvent.
We walk the true middle way by putting forward nothing and denying nothing, relying on the signless to achieve liberation.
And finally, we dedicate that empty merit to an empty world out of boundless, non-dual compassion.
If we bring this all back to you, the listener, and your highly advanced practice, the importance of this hymn cannot be overstated. This is not just a clever philosophical word game or a historical curiosity.
No, it is an active, aggressive map for acting without acting in your daily life.
Yeah.
When you deeply internalize that all phenomena, your thoughts, your relationships, your spiritual progress, your failures, even these very teachings are dependently co-arisen and empty, you stop fighting reality.
You allow yourself to perceive everything as primordially pure and divine without ever attaching to the concept of purity. You engage fully, but you grasp at nothing.
You navigate the mirage with perfect clarity without ever dying of thirst.
But I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over as you step back into your day, something that builds on that very last verse we discussed. In verse 28, Nagarjuna dedicates his merit to free the entire world from the bondage of signs. If ultimate liberation is the complete and total freedom from the bondage of signs, what does that mean for the text we just spent this deep dive analyzing?
That's a profound question.
Is the Lokatitastava itself, with its brilliant metaphors, its rigorous logic, its devastating deployment of the tetralemma, is it the final sign, the ultimate conceptual map that you must be willing to burn in order to truly hear the lion's roar?